Good afternoon, everyone. Gareth Presch, founder of the World Health Innovation Summit. Delighted to welcome you to our discussion on healthcare, foreign direct investment. And I'm extremely pleased to introduce Courtney Fingar, who is an expert in this space, looks after media and comms, has worked with the Financial Times, and will give us a real insight into the opportunities that we have from a healthcare perspective to alleviate the pressure that's currently on the system, but also work with the financial institutions around the world to bring about positive change and hopefully deliver the global goals by 2030. Courtney, delighted to welcome you to the webinar today, and please give people a flavor and introduction to the work you've been doing.
Well, thanks so much for having me, especially to talk around this incredibly important topic. I am the founder of a consultancy called Fingar Direct Investment that advises governments on investment attraction, but in particular through strategic communications. As you mentioned, I have a long background working in FDI, covering it from the journalist side, but I've moved now into the practitioner aspect. And of course, I've always had an eye across all sectors, but healthcare, especially in the era of COVID, has come to the fore as one of the most pressing and urgent needs, and therefore, along with that, one of the most interesting investment opportunities in the post-pandemic era.
So with that, let me bring in just a few slides to explain the opportunity to people who are watching from a visual or listening. And, by the way, if you have a question, please do pop it in the chat and myself and Courtney will take the question. But I want to explain to people what we're talking about here and what the World Health Innovation Summit is doing with partners around the world and how we can deliver the SDGs. So at the moment, people will be familiar. Our whole health system is on the left-hand side. It's pretty much a sick care system. And on the right-hand side is what we're trying to promote is good health and well-being. And you may say, well, what's that got to do with economics? Well, COVID has really shown that it has everything to do with economics. Because if you're not fitting well, you don't have a job, the economy basically comes to a standstill. So what we're trying to do is work with investors around the world to show, and governments, to show by making savvy investments, you can actually boost economic growth, give people new jobs, and also strengthen the health system to future pandemics. So if we go forward, and then you may say, well, what does the World Health Innovation look like? Now, this was pre-pandemic, and this is our platform. And the beauty about this model is that if you look at that picture, that's your GP practice, your general practice at scale. So you're able to influence population health at a very big level, 5,000, 10,000 people. And the idea is you can bring this model to London, to Mumbai, to LA, to Kinshasa, all over the world, and you can replicate it. And it makes sound business sense. Now, if we bring in the investment cycle, and this is where Courtney will be an expert in this space, you'll see what I mean, as in the people are the drivers of the investment. So when they make a decision about what they want to buy or who they want to support, that's where the flow of money comes from. And this is probably the most important slide that I'll show you. And this is our plan. And then what does that mean in terms of bringing the health sector along? Well, what we want to try and do is bring in the pension funds from the health sector, look at 1% of the pension fund and see if we can manage that into projects that make, for example, change in climate, the climate situation. So that's a very short overview. Now I'll go back to Courtney and just ask, from your perspective, from a foreign direct investment perspective and an investment perspective, how big an opportunity is this?
Well, it's a massive opportunity, and there are several reasons for that. One is just the obvious point that the need is so massive. The World Health Organization estimates that as much as half the world's population lacks access to good health care. So the need is completely overwhelming, and that creates a favorable market dynamic. It's also clear that the public sector is struggling to meet that need. Thus, there is a need for private capital, private investors, and private companies to play a role. So this can operate at a few different levels. On the one hand, you have the traditional FDI, so healthcare companies themselves setting up new operations and investing in foreign countries. What we've seen is that Investment Monitor, which was my previous outfit for which I was working, has a database that tracks greenfield FDI, so physical facilities set up by private companies in foreign territories. And the database tracked a 111% increase in greenfield FDI projects by healthcare companies between 2020 and 2021. So it's pretty obvious the reason for that jump after the events of 2020. But where there's a problem in all of that is if you look at the destinations for those investments, it's still North America is the leading destination, and Europe features heavily. Whereas the places in the world that need this investment most of all, and that's not to sort of downplay the need in developed markets as well, because it's also there, but there's a huge gap between where investment is flowing and where it's most urgently needed. And this is where we get into, of course, ESG and the Sustainable Development Goals with SDG number 3 relating to health. But you could probably argue that health underpins most of the Sustainable Development Goals because there is an impact and a relationship between poverty, climate change, as we saw in the introduction to the video. So you have investors, both companies, but also financial investors, very keen these days to meet ESG criteria, to be impactful investors, and to help support the Sustainable Development Goals. Well, there are a few better ways that you could tick all 3 of those boxes than investing in healthcare around the world. So this is where I see both the need and the opportunity.
Yeah, and also so to put things into context for people, so there's over 3.5 billion people who don't have access to any healthcare. We have at the moment waiting lists, and if you take, if you take the UK, for example, there's 7 million people currently waiting on a waiting list for elective surgery. So the need is enormous in terms of access to care. And then in terms of, we're looking at, 18 million staff pre-pandemic short by 2030. So we can't retain or recruit staff. Now, there's opportunities for smart investments to be put into prevention. And this is what we're trying to do with the World Health Innovation Summit, is establish ourselves in these cities, in these emerging markets, and then bring that investment through a trusted network to be able to access that capital flow in, to identify the projects and make them bankable for the investors. I mean, Courtney, do you see that as a huge opportunity from your perspective? I mean, the market space as well is $12 trillion.
Well, it's absolutely a huge opportunity because this traditional FDI, so investment, on the ground investment from healthcare companies, can only go so far. I mean, that's important, but limited in its scope and its impact. Institutional capital and financial investment is really the key to making any progress here and to really making a difference. And that's essentially what you're talking about here. And it's important that there not just be the capital, because there is the capital there ready to be deployed. There's interest in it. But it's all about how productive is it, how targeted is it, and ultimately how effective is it. And that's where it's really relevant what kind of platform is used and where and how this capital is directed.
And that was the point we made in 2018 in terms of the value proposition, because we were able to demonstrate just by doing, our own work here in the UK, a pound invested 36 back in societal impact. So if you look at the opportunity cost there in the market to create new and meaningful jobs, I know today the care sector, for example, the World Economic Forum has just published a paper saying 300 million jobs can be created by 2035. And then if you look at the current situation in the UK, just as an example, you have 100,000 vacancies in the NHS. If we have leadership, we can move that money into a different department per se and move those recurring cash flows into a preventative model, which creates new and meaningful jobs. And then if you talk about emerging markets, Courtney, I suppose the opportunity is to learn from our mistakes, isn't it? A really opportunity for emerging markets. Do you see like Africa, Latin America, and the MENA region, and Asia, of course, do they have a competitive advantage in this space, a time advantage?
Well, there is an advantage in that, again, the need is there. So where you have a need, it creates a market opportunity. And that's where I think investors really should be looking. What I noticed last week was at the MIPIM event in Cannes, and was speaking with a number of institutional investors there, sovereign wealth investors and pension funds. And although the market is incredibly challenging, and actually in particular in developing countries, the market's quite challenging in the US and Europe right now. So they're looking very actively elsewhere and quite keen on emerging markets where they see the biggest opportunity. And they're also very keen on sectors where they see growth opportunities, and healthcare would clearly fit the bill there. So I think there is an exciting moment where there's interest and a willingness from investors on the one side, and major need and opportunities on the other. Where it becomes difficult, you mentioned earlier about bankable projects. Yeah. Something that comes up time and time again in any discussion, and in particular around the Sustainable Development Goals, is the fact that investors are keen to invest in SDG friendly and ESG compliant projects, but they very often will say there are not actually enough bankable and investable projects. Whereas on the government side, they clearly have projects that they want and need to offer. So there's a slight mismatch there in terms of the investor expectations and the needs of those seeking investment. And sometimes it's just a matter of packaging. It's not that the opportunity isn't there. And that's where I think we need to work really hard to try to bridge these two sides, because you have ready capital, interested capital, and you have massive need. But there's this wide gulf in between. And you see that gulf most notably in places like Africa and in other developing economies.
Isn't it just a case maybe of just taking a little bit of risk as well? And, because quite a lot of government agencies, because I worked for the public health sector myself, and, to have this conversation with the private sector would be seen as unheard of, but it's needed. Like in order to accelerate, to get to the change that we need, we actually have to take a risk.
Yeah, I agree with that. Absolutely. And actually risk on the both sides. So for the public authorities to think creatively and to be open to engagement with private sector players and financiers and investors, but also the investors themselves to be willing to take a bit of risk, to do work and invest in places where it's going to be the most impactful, even if that's a slightly riskier proposition.
Yeah, and I suppose as well, we have to be clear as well that the investments as well, they bring a return.
Yes.
It's not, these are, like if you look at energy investments, you're looking 8-10-fold return. Health may be slightly lower, but there are huge market opportunities here. Like, I mean, in the emerging markets that you say, I mean, we have investment conferences coming up, and we have COP. And one of the areas I really wanted to talk to you about was like, do you think, that the capital flow will go into climate change activities quick enough? We only have 2% of climate finance, I think, is related to health. So that's enormous scope for change.
Yes, and I think there's obviously a lot of talk and a lot of interest in climate finance, and also investing in, let's say, climate friendly projects, but there's often a lack on the investor side of knowing where to put that money, because actually it's such a big issue and there's so much talk. And this sort of gets into the complexity of ESG and impact investment more generally, where there is an interest to do the right thing and invest in the right places and the right things, but it's really hard to always know what and where those are. And this is where you get into thorny issues of ESG reporting, worries about greenwashing. I mean, it's a real landmine when investors try to deploy capital in a way that they think will be impactful. And then there's not really any easy solution. And this comes back again to how are the opportunities presented? What are the mechanisms for identifying and matching these opportunities? But I think even more so than in the healthcare sector, when it's anything to do with climate change, people get extremely nervous about greenwashing, about knowing, about reporting, about regulation, about being able to measure. One of the things I heard over and over again at MIPIM, I was moderating a forum of some of the world's largest capital owners, and they were all saying, I mean, they have massive interest in ESG investment, not just because they view it as the right thing or good PR, but the number one reason in a survey that KPMG did that they're interested in ESG projects is actually because they view it as the best way to make returns. So exactly. They see the opportunity. but they were asked to consider a question of what keeps you up at night and to talk about the challenges. One of their biggest challenges is around valuation, saying that these days they no longer really understand the value of things and value of investment opportunities, which is a problem. The other thing is around ESG, and that as much as it's an opportunity, issues around reporting, understanding it, regulation, and valuation are extremely difficult for them to unpack. And this is where, again, there is a real need for expertise somewhere there in the middle of the chain between the investors and the end use of the capital that they might deploy.
And I think that's where, for having subject matter experts involved in the process, so for example, me and you having this conversation, it wouldn't have happened 24 months ago, but myself and yourself, we had a coffee, we discussed what the opportunities were, how could we bridge the gap, how could we make that leap of faith into the financial sector, how could we bring the health sector along, because quite a lot of investments in the health sector are going into the wrong area. So we have this huge need, but investments are going into the wrong area. You have a lot of investments, you build new facilities, but there's no staff,
Right.
So, despite the fact we have this huge need. So I think, there is a lot of opportunity, but, do we need leadership? That's my question as well.
Well, absolutely, you need leadership and you need buy-in from all the relevant stakeholders, which is obviously a very easy thing to say and a bit more difficult to deliver. And I want to pick up on a comment in the comment chain. And thank you for those who are tuning in. Thank you, Jimba, for your comment. And Leaf has made the comment that this is all very pertinent in the context of SVB and Credit Suisse. And absolutely. And there were these rumbling fears of contagion in the banking sector have heightened investors, I guess, risk antenna. And that is a slight problem, again, when it comes to how willing they are to invest worldwide. It's not completely off-putting, but some of these storm clouds that are brewing in the global financial system are going to make all of this just a slight bit more difficult. But that makes it even more important that the investment that does come and the capital that's deployed is used most effectively.
Yeah, I think I'm fortunate enough to work with Dr. Prasun Mishra. We've been putting together some work around Global Sustainable Impact Fund, and we're trying to work with investors around the world and philanthropic family offices. We're trying to work with the government agencies, and we're trying to make that value proposition to say, first and foremost, start with healthcare because it's a critical driver of the economy. I think if we can bring the stakeholders together and get momentum pre-COP, because for me, it's really alarming. The statistics are so overwhelming when you look at the numbers. Millions of people die every year from air pollution. We're consuming at least a credit card a week of plastic. The messaging and even the changes in our climate, it's so alarming. And we need to also switch energy consumption. The sense of urgency. I think we have to accelerate that process. Do you think that by bringing in experts from different sectors and bringing all the stakeholders together, can we achieve the 2030 goals? Do we need to? We definitely need the ambition.
Well, I'd say that's the only way there is hope of achieving the goals. There are a lot of worries that we're already behind in terms of where we need to be to meet these targets in 2030. But the worst thing to do would be to give up on them. And I can't see any way of actually achieving them without this cross-fertilization of expertise and stakeholders across these different areas. And as we kind of mentioned at the start, health has a direct relation to so many of the other pressing issues of our time, including climate change, but it cuts right across nearly all of the SDGs. So there's no achieving the SDGs at all without urgent care being given to global health.
Yeah, for example, if you don't have clean water, you've got no health. So, there's billions, about over 2 billion people who don't have access to clean water. So, that's a pretty startling, it was World Water Day the other day. From the financial sector's perspective, do you think there is that sea of change coming? Do you feel that there's a momentum shift to say, okay, we need to do business slightly differently?
Yes, and sometimes it's hard to know what is just lip service, but I actually think even the fact it's coming out of so many lips is still very useful. I don't think there's even a discussion anymore about whether it makes sense to have ESG front of mind or to try to be impactful investors. That debate is largely over. Now there are some entities and some places in the world where that's less the case, including, unfortunately, in many parts of the United States and some of the economically important states like Texas, where there's a bit of an anti-ESG backlash. That aside, the debate is largely settled that this is necessary. It's the way of doing business, not just because it feels like the right thing, but going back to the survey results that I mentioned, it's also seen as the smart way to invest. And so I think this does give us an opportunity. The will is there. We just have to work on the practicalities, and that's where things become slightly trickier.
Yeah, I mean, only time will tell. I mean, COP28, I think, has a big, gives us a big opportunity to see if we can actually mobilize the global partners. I think, hosting it in the MENA region will bring, substantial opportunity to see if we can actually move away from fossil fuels. I think Larry Fink from BlackRock has mentioned that, the next, IPO companies will all come from clean energy, green energy. I think if we can merge that into a value proposition that improves people's health and well-being, that could be very substantial, And I suppose there's these new and emerging markets in Africa. I mean, do you see Africa as a driving force?
Absolutely. And again, it's partly because of the need and the need creating the opportunities. But we're seeing African investment promotion agencies and African governments being incredibly proactive at, first of all, identifying and understanding that this is the type of investment that would best serve their purposes, but also trying to attract that investment and trying to engage investors in the space.
So I think you're an expert on attracting investment. So let's look at Europe, for example, because that and UK and other. How is it best to attract investment? Because I'm sure there's people are watching and saying, okay, this is fantastic, but how do we do it?
Well, it first starts from identifying very carefully what the investment needs are in that particular location. So what would best serve their economic development goals and general development goals? So that is identifying the need. But the need on the location side isn't enough. It has to be tied to an opportunity. So what is the need? What opportunities does that open up? Where, very specifically, whether that's in a sectoral basis or even an asset class, where does that location feel that they genuinely have an opportunity to offer international investors? Then there's thinking around, okay, this is our need. These are the opportunities that we have to offer. Who are we offering them to, and how? And how are we packaging the opportunity specifically to that investor? Because what happens quite a lot of the time is it's all very broad brush. So we all see locations around the world say they'll list off a list of maybe 5 or 6 quite generic investment attributes that most locations around the world can say, but it needs to be much more specific. So if there's an identification of the investors, both financial investors, but corporate investors, as in companies that might potentially be interested in that location's offering, then what are you taking to them? It requires studying those investors, their profile, their past footprint, what tends to interest them, and then matching how does your location solve a problem or offer something to that company or that investor. And it's all about being very specific. And I always use the word packaging. It's packaging the opportunity, making it very relevant to that particular investor. And this is where I see that a lot of investment promotion agencies and authorities often need the help, because we get very often way too generic. What it requires to identify the investors is usually data, studying where are the investors that have invested in similar projects worldwide, and coming up with your target list, and then packaging the opportunity and showing that investor that you've actually thought about their needs and how your location and your offer fits into their corporate expansion strategy. And that may sound very basic, but very often it doesn't happen because the location will talk only about their needs and their wants and their goals and not think about how it might serve the broader strategy of that investor.
Yeah, and that really sets the tone for like the kind of next area I kind of wanted to touch on before we have a final thought. It was around the health. So like, what makes it very desirable for, expansion in Europe, say in Ireland or UK or even in America, is the fact that they have healthcare, so that, and people are fitting well, they can attend work, they can manage their own well-being. And that's a real driver, isn't it? So it's like for emerging markets, if they can get the foundation down and support their population, it'll make it easier for investment.
Well, that's absolutely right, because one of the factors that's considered, and it's maybe not always the top factor, but quality of life is very relevant when we talk about investment destinations, and the health is related to that. Where health is probably even more important is that the number one factor considered for corporate expansion is talent. So if you've not got a healthy workforce, you've not got an attractive workforce. So again, there's no getting around the importance of health, whether as a driver of investment or as a pull factor for investment.
Well, I mean, last week I had the pleasure to meet Microsoft in Europe, the European headquarters in Dublin. Absolutely fantastic setup. The way they treat their staff was amazing. You go in, canteen, they have a games room, the whole lot. I mean, you want to work there. But that's also the employees are fit and conscious. I had a chat with one of the guys and he was telling me, I walk to work now because he's conscious of it.
Yeah. I mean, this is part of, very sorry to interrupt. This is just part of being also responsible employer and responsible investor in other countries in terms of looking after staff and encouraging and supporting health of the staff as well.
Yep. So I wanted to kind of just finally touch on some final points from your perspective, kind of takeaways from this discussion. And if you can, where do you see the next 12 to 24 months? If you could give a broad oversight where you see the opportunities, can healthcare and the financial industry come together? That's a space to watch.
Well, first of all, to ask your last question first, yes, they absolutely can. And I think it's happening. I think we're making progress, but there's much further to go. And I hope conversations like this one can actually aid that as a goal. What I do expect is that FDI in healthcare is going to continue to multiply and explode over the next year and years, again, simply because the demand is so huge, and that makes it a necessary, urgent investment opportunity. So I don't see any let up in that. What we can expect, though, is despite the boom in cross-border investment in healthcare, no matter how much bigger it gets over the next 12 months, it's probably still not going to meet the ultimate demand. So we have to continue to press ahead and highlight these investment opportunities and try our best to be that bridge between the need and demand and the investor appetite and interest.
No, absolutely. And just finally, Courtney, where can people get in touch with yourself?
Well, I have a website, which is fingar-di.com. Or you can always connect with me on LinkedIn, and I would welcome continuing this conversation at any time. And thank you again for those who've tuned in and added your comments there in the chat. And thank you most of all, Gareth, for the opportunity to talk around this topic.
No, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope in the coming months we see some progress and we can have a further chat and we can discuss what we've actually achieved, if we can get to the goals, if we can actually bring the investors together and help, colleagues around the world who need to see capital flow into lower middle income countries, for example. So for those who've joined us, I just want to say thanks. If you're on recording, thanks very much. And everything is available on our website. It's www.wis.world and our hashtag is WIS. So for myself and Courtney, we'll sign out, but thanks for joining, and I hope you will join us at our next webinar. So thanks everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you.